Welcome to another episode of Commending and Contending. It's a podcast about how the gospel of Jesus encourages us to live our lives and use our words to commend and contend for Jesus and his gospel. I'm your host, Jonathan Holt. Joining me today is Candice. G'day, Candice.
Hello, good to be with you, Jonathan.
Where has God planted you?
Right now, he's planted me in Sydney, which is a strange thing in some ways because I was a country kid who never imagined that I would live in the city, work in the city. So that's quite a strange thing in if you ask my childhood self. But I grew up in country New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria. We moved around a little bit. And in terms of the Lord's work in my life, he worked through a number of things. I became a Christian through a very small youth group during high school. Sometimes it was me, the minister, and his wife. So a really small youth group where, for the first time in my life, we really opened the Bible and got to see what it was that Jesus did for us. That it wasn't about my religiosity. I think I had a bit of a superstitious grain where I felt like I had to do the right things, religious things particularly, in order to make life go okay, that nothing bad would happen. And to read about Jesus who gave himself for us, and that my salvation was based on what he has done, not what I do, and that it can be assured was an amazing thing that I learned kind of in my later high school years. And since then, I stayed in the country. I went to university in Wagga and was involved in the Christian group on campus there with the AFES, the Australian Fellowship of Evangelical Students. For those who don't know, it's a bit of a mouthful. And we read the Bible, and I was surrounded by peers. You know, going from this very small youth group to be surrounded by peers in the Bible together, living together, thinking together, making life decisions alongside each other. That was really, really significant for me to think about. Well, Jesus is Lord and he has a plan for this world. How does my life actually align with that plan? How the decisions that I'm making, whether they're really small decisions like how do I befriend people in my class, to kind of the more kind of life direction decisions, I guess, that you're making, particularly in those uni years. How am I going to live? What am I going to spend my time doing? How can I best serve the Lord with who he's made me to be? And that led to lots of conversations, and one thing led to another. And I did a ministry apprenticeship there with the campus a couple of years later. And after Bible college, went back to serve with the AFES in Melbourne for a number of years. So, kind of long story, lots of great times on campus in Melbourne. And then more recently, I've moved back to Sydney, as I said, and started thinking about, well, how can I serve the Lord with who I am and how he's made me to be? And that's led me to doing a PhD in theology of ethics here in Sydney. So, long story, but that's where God's planted me. That's where I am now, what I'm doing now.
That's a great answer. And a shout out to all those people in small youth groups all around the country serving faithfully. Be encouraged in the fruit that can come from that faithful ministry, from the smallest of seeds that's planted in someone's life. Candice, how has God been encouraging you recently?
Recently, I had the great delight to go back to one of my previous churches to visit the women's Bible groups in the morning. They have a morning each week, each Thursday, where they gather around the word. They gather, I think it's like 3 or 4 different Bible study groups that have a creche for the kids of the mums who are there. They have a bit of time together with morning tea and mingling, and then they break off into their different groups. And something I loved about it was the diversity of people that were there. So it wasn't, I mean, we're all women, but there was old women, there was younger women, there was mums, there were people without children, there was an easy English group with people not just from one single background, but a number of different backgrounds. There were people who've been Christian for years and years and years, people who are brand new to the faith. And I got to speak to one woman who was really brand new. She was like, this is my first time here at the church. And I think she'd been to a church service before, but um, she was from a country where she's never really heard anything much about Jesus. And she was curious and she wanted to meet people. She wanted to practice her English. She wanted to learn about Jesus, who these people believe in. And we had a really great conversation, just thinking about world events, different religions. Um, how do you learn about God from the Bible? And so, yeah, the diversity of people, the range of conversations that we could have, the depth of study did. It was just a really wonderful place to spend morning, and so encouraged by being there.
I wanted to come back to the work you're doing at the moment. You're midway into a PhD, so maybe it's still up to that bit where you're excited to talk about it and it hasn't ground you down too much just yet. From what I've learned from others doing PhDs, there's different phases in your time of study. But I'd love to unpack with you a little bit ethics, how we live, how we decide things, and how does a Christian come to have Christian ethics? Are there particular things that ought to be shaping us or we ought to think about when we commend the gospel in how we live ethically in the world?
Yeah, I I think that's a really important question, and that's kind of how I got into it myself. I was, as I said, serving with the AFES for a number of years, and part of my role was to work on some uh, ethics material to teach students to think about Christian ethics. And as I kind of step back and I'm thinking, well, if there's one thing I want them to take away from this strand, just the big picture kind of idea, one thing that they should get out of this material, if they walk away with nothing else, that would still be a win. And I was like, I think they really need to be convinced that God is good, um, and that God's ways are good. He's good for us. Um, because I encountered on campus in talking with students, whether they're Christians or not Christians, the the challenge of whether God is good was really real for people, really significant in um, coming to faith. Like it can be an obstacle. Like I'm not sure this Christianity is good for people. Like maybe there's a God, but do I want to know him? Um, Maybe as I look around the world, whether I'm Christian or not, I'm like, I'm not sure whether God's ways are good. And without that foundation, without that confidence, I think it's very hard to think about anything else ethically. How do you go on if and trusting God and obeying God if you don't trust that He's good? But at the same time, knowing Jesus and having that conviction that He's made His goodness known to us in Jesus, irrefutably, He's made His love known to us. He's shown that He's for us, and the way that He's given us to live, while not always easy and doesn't always end up in a life that feels comfortable or feels like it, certainly Christian lives don't lack suffering. Often that's part of the course. But what God gives us in following His ways is the way of life. Like you think of, back in Deuteronomy, I think chapter 30, where God gives Israel a choice. I'm giving you a choice between life and good, death and evil, and choose life. Like to obey God is the way of life, because life exists. Life in its fullness is fellowship with God, and that's what the gospel makes available to us, and that's what God calls us to live in fellowship with Him. So, yeah, thinking about ethics, that was my kind of starting point, my foundation, the kind of pastoral questions, and seeing that I think this is really exciting and really important for us to be thinking about. And I personally wanted to think about it a whole lot more. So, yeah, ended up here studying it in depth.
So that headline's really helpful, I think, that to take hold of that confidence that we hear over and over again in scriptures that God is good and his ways are just. He is good in all he does. But then, like you say, there can sometimes feel like a bit of a mismatch between knowing that to be true from the Bible and then having stuff in the world be very much more complicated and mixed up and challenging to unravel. Where do you think where do you see yourself going in your study in terms of trying to unpick some of these questions around how we think about what is God's good way to live, the Christian ethic. How do we do that? How do we do that in partnership with God?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, with a PhD, you start with as you're pondering all these many, many ideas, and you know, a big part of the challenge, especially early on, which is where I am, is narrowing it down to something. Even though you think PhDs are really big, you actually need something that's really quite specific and narrow. And that intersection between um, our living, our doing the work, and God's work in us to enable us to do it is where I'm particularly focusing, as it turns out. Which I think we're looking at the work of the Spirit. What does it mean to live by the Spirit? What does it mean to walk by the Spirit, to keep in step to the Spirit? And how does the Spirit help us? How does God Himself help us to not only just appreciate the good and like it from afar, but to actually enact it, to live it out in our lives? So one of the kind of key verses in my project is kind of like a headline verse, I guess, is from Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, where it says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act for his good pleasure. Um, so that willing and acting, how does the Spirit work in our wills even? How does he change what we come to love, what we recognize as good? Because sometimes the dissonance is I'm holding on to something as good, but actually God needs to help me see what's really good. How does maybe I need to let go of something? Maybe I just need to see it in perspective. How does God help me to appreciate the good and see and know him as good? And how does he help me to act and act that? How does he actually free me to do good as well, to empower me by his spirit? So that's really the zone where I'm at.
And that is such a helpful verse, isn't it? Even when it seems in some ways mysteriously to capture both me doing the work and God doing the work. Have you kind of begun to wrestle much with why is it that Christians either seem to think God's left me alone to do it all, and if I can just pull myself up by my bootstraps, maybe I will make him happy with my good life, or other Christians who kind of go, I'm just going to sit back and wait for God to kind of magically turn me into the holy person he wants me to be. How do we keep both of those together in our minds and hearts?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a constant tension, isn't it? On the one hand, we're so um, resistant to grace in a way. We
Mm.
struggle, we've probably all had times where we struggle to know God's forgiveness, know that it's about that conversion thing that I was talking about before, that it's about what Jesus has done, not what I bring. Um, but we also can easily go, oh, um, do I just let go and let God? Do I just kind of not do it? But I think you see the two together a lot in the Bible. Paul, he strives with all his energy. I think is it Colossians,
Mm.
where and yet God is working so powerfully in him. Like the two are always together. And I think this, as we think about ethics, one of the parts of ethics, I guess, that we can think about is agency. So how do we actually take responsibility for our actions? How do we act in a way that's us acting? That it's not I'm not just a puppet on strings. It's me that's acting.
Mm.
And I think when the Spirit works in us, He doesn't kind of wipe out our agency as if we're no longer there. But it is those two things together. He's transforming me into a full human, I guess, that is empowered by God. Something I was reading the other day was quite interesting about even thinking about how does this work with Jesus?
Yeah.
That Jesus himself relied on the power of the Spirit in his true humanity. one of the things I was reading pointed me to Isaiah 42, which God is speaking of the servant that he's going to send, his chosen servant, who he will put his spirit on. And the spirit's the one that enables Jesus. Um, Jesus is different from us in that he's also, God the
Mm.
Son in the flesh, but he's fully human and he's got the spirit working in him. He's relying on the strength that God provides to enable him to persevere in doing, living a good human life in obedience to God. Um, and which, if I can just keep adding on, brings
Yeah,
me
keep
to
going.
another
This is
point.
helpful so far.
Um, I think sometimes we think obedience is a bit of a yucky word. Our society certainly does. And
Yeah.
so maybe in us, we think, um, I don't like the idea of obedience. And sometimes that can be because we want to preserve something good, which is our justification by faith alone. We don't want
Mm.
to imply that we're adding um, works to our salvation, which is that's really an important thing to preserve. Um, but at the same time, we're saved to live this life that God has given us, which is a life in fellowship with God. And He helps us by His word, as His Spirit works in us, to trustingly obey Him. And that obedience is a good thing. And so I think sometimes we can think of activity there. Obedience is not this boring thing that, oh, I guess I have to do it, I'll just obey. We can willingly embrace the ways of God by obeying Him. And that's an active thing. And yet it's yielding my will to God's will as I realize that actually maybe I need to trust what He says rather than not obey and do what I
Mm.
think is often, it might not be that I feel like, oh, I just don't want to do it. It might be that, oh, that seems really hard and scary, or that feels overwhelming, or I just don't know if that will work, or, all these. There's many reasons why we might struggle to obey. It's not all kind of hostile. It can be
Yeah.
angsty. But that obedience that God gives us um, invites our agency, invites us to act willingly, and yet it's not contrary to yielding our will to God's will and submitting to Him. So I think you see in our agency as Christians, it's a relational thing. It's not a
Mm.
independent thing, but it's in relationship with God. And I think that's really beautiful and really maybe surprising in some ways,
Yeah.
but yeah, quite exciting as well.
And I think it does help to see our agency the way you've just described it there, that it's something done in relationship with God. And in a sense, it's God's spirit enabling us to reverse the disaster of Genesis 3 and Eden, where Eve and Adam used their agency to disobey God
Yeah.
and in a way shrink what obedience becomes. Obedience becomes an unwilling, grudging thing, which is such a narrow kind of obedience, a very distant and unrelational obedience. But it
Mm.
sounds like you're talking about a fuller, bigger picture where obedience is a willing, lovely, rejoicing thing in
Yeah.
relationship with God. And I wonder whether that maybe helps us, in Hebrews, all the times in which the Son learns obedience and he shows himself to be fully equipped as our Savior by being obedient. And there's nothing
Mm.
grudging in Jesus' obedience. There's nothing narrow or small or rebellious in it. It's so joyful and relational.
Yeah. And it's free, isn't it? Like the Spirit frees us to be who we've been saved to be,
Mm.
free from that slavery to sin, free from all of yeah, um, the things that would make us not trust God. And, you know, Christians will testify that the Christian life is one of struggle. The work of the Spirit doesn't mean um, now I don't sin anymore
Yeah.
in this life, sadly. Um, we feel the struggle. But I think that's part of the reality of this time where we're still waiting for the fullness, but we have the deposit of the Spirit, that guarantee
Mm.
of where we're headed.
Yeah, the world being subject to decay in Romans 8 and us still feeling the effects of that. And in some ways, I like to uh, speak of it as that sense that we are struggling against our sin is part of how the Spirit is helping us to reorder our world, not welcome and love our sin, but actually hate our sin and want to put it to death.
Yeah, yeah, we can grieve it. We can mourn it. We can struggle against it. And those are all signs of life, I think. Like they're signs of the Spirit working in us.
Mm,
And we don't need to do that without hope. Like it's
mm.
really, I find it easy to feel really hopeless when I get aware of my sinfulness and aware of all the things that I'm like, oh, even my heart is not in the right place, you know. But I have hope. I need to look back to Jesus and to go, He's given me His Spirit. This awareness of sin, this conviction of sin is a sign of His work in me. Um, yeah, embrace it, grieve it, but keep going, you know. That temptation to wallow in sin is not something to embrace. That's something to be freed from as we know the forgiveness that Jesus has given us.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of Paul speaking about how he puts behind him that old self
Mm,
and strives forward for that thing he's hoping for. Hasn't got it fully
yeah.
yet, but he's reaching forward to that which God has reached into him for. And
Mm,
that's I find that's a really helpful picture of that hopeful moving forward.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a great example.
When should we check in with you again, Candice, about kind of the PhD being all done and when you've got all the answers and you know you're ready to tell us how we hold together the work of God by His Spirit and our own agency? How much longer to go on the project?
Oh, so the ideal is getting the whole thing done in 3 years. So that will give me another 18 months. But more realistically, it might take closer to 4 years. So somewhere in that ballpark, God willing, we'll see how it goes.
Well, thanks for chatting with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.